Well, good afternoon and welcome to Longwood Gardens. My name is Colvin Randall. I have been working at Longwood for, I guess, 46, 47 years now, and before that I was a student. And a lot of that time has been spent doing research on Longwood, and I'm going to share that with you today in the history of Garden of Music, the history of performing arts at Longwood. We've published a new book jointly with Jonathan Ambrosino, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but I'm going to try to summarize what's in the book, and maybe you'd be interested enough to purchase a copy.
Well worth it.
So, the book is 320 pages, and it has over 900 illustrations, and some of the illustrations I think are beautiful. I don't know if any of you have any idea where this was taken, but this is a medallion that's next door in the music room, and it celebrates the performing arts. And the entire book has 13 chapters with 2 appendices, and I'm going to try to summarize for you everything that's in the book in a matter of maybe 45 minutes. So, of course, it's mostly, to begin with, about Pierre DuPont, who was certainly one of the most capable businessmen of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. Some credit him with being the father of the modern corporation. But his beginnings were much simpler. He was born in 1870 at Nemours, a family property, which I'll show you in a minute. His mother was very loving. She was a talented musician. She played the piano, and sometimes she would substitute at Christ Church Christian 100 playing the organ. Pierre's father was loving, but he was a little more stern, and he said, he impressed upon Pierre that a man would never amount to anything if he wore pince-nez, which are the spectacles that stick on your nose. Secondly, a man would never amount to anything if he smoked cigarettes. And Pierre noted, well, his father wore spectacles and his father smoked cigars, so maybe he shouldn't worry so much about that disapproval. But the third thing was that his father thought that no man would ever amount to anything if he played the piano. And Pierre certainly disagreed with that. But the house was spacious, but not a huge mansion, and he had 9 surviving brothers and sisters. And they were somewhat frugal in the house. He noted that when we had an entertainment, instead of lighting 2 candles, they would light oil lamps, rather. They would light 6 of them. So they would have, in the living room, there was a piano, and his mother would play, and people would sing songs. And his favorite piece was The Little Brown Jug. And one day he was in the room, and the piano was uncovered, and he very gingerly tapped out the melody to The Little Brown Jug. And he said he was so afraid of his father's disapproval that he didn't try playing the piano again until they moved into Philadelphia. And they moved to Philadelphia in 1881. His father was building a dynamite plant across the river in New Jersey. And so this because his father was absent, I think gave Pierre more time to learn to play the piano. And he actually writes to his mother. He was visiting his cousins down on the Brandywine, and he said, they're all asking me to play the piano. You know, how do they know I even played? So somehow he was learning to play the piano at a very early age. But in 1884, his father was killed in a chemical explosion, nitroglycerin explosion, so Pierre became the surrogate father to his 9 brothers and sisters. He went to MIT to study chemistry, and the first thing he did was to rent a piano, and this is a picture of his apartment, and he played a lot, not only on his own, but for his fraternity. And his letters to his mother talk a lot about his artistic experiences in Boston, going to the theater, playing the piano, and going to concerts. He also played poker a lot, and here you see Pierre, he's second from the left there. After MIT, he came back and he helped, for his mother, he oversaw the construction of the new family home, St. Amour, which was on Pennsylvania Avenue, now the Tower Hill playing fields. And he joined his cousin Alfred DuPont's Tankopanicon Orchestra, and that's Pierre seated at the piano, the only picture we have ever seen of him at a musical instrument. But the story is told in the family that after one particularly poor performance. Alfred said, "If I had had a baseball bat, I would have hit you over the head." And Pierre replied, "I wish you had." So he was working for the DuPont company, and then he left and moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was working in land development. And apparently Lorain was something of a cultural wasteland until Pierre bought a pianola. He discovered the pianola, which was a device that you would move up to a regular piano, and it had little levers on it. And you would pump it with your feet, and you would use your hands to control a paper roll, like a player piano, and it would play the piano. And he was crazy about this thing. And he also bought one for his mother's Steinway, a Chase & Baker one. And so then he started becoming very interested in these automated musical instruments. And he bought an orchestrelle, which is an extremely fancy and expensive reed organ that you would pump by your feet. And then a couple years later, he traded this in for an even fancier one. And this was $2,500, which was a lot of money back then in 1900. And he would subscribe to the Aeolian company for a monthly fee, they would send you rolls which you could then preview and either buy or return for new ones. And he eventually bought a player piano that had the player built in. In 1904, he went to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis for 10 days, and one of the features in the festival hall was this very large pipe organ of 10,000 pipes. And it was the week he was there, it was played by Alexandre Guilmant, who was a very famous French organist. He was so famous that they raised the admission for the concert from 25 cents to 50 cents. And the hall sat 4,000 people, and many times it was totally full. And later that organ was shipped to Philadelphia, where it became the basis for the Wanamaker organ, which still exists today. And also when he was in the World Columbian Exposition in 1893, Guilmant just happened to be there that same week, so it's probable that he heard him play there also. In 1915, he married Alice Beelan, his cousin, who also shared his musical instruments, and at Hagley is still a collection of her sheet music of piano, vocal, and piano with mandolin accompaniment, so presumably she also played. In 1913, he and his brother-in-law, R.M. Carpenter, and his former secretary, J.J. Raskob, decided to build the Playhouse in Wilmington, and as part of the Hotel DuPont and the DuPont building. And it was put up in record time and is still in existence and has hosted hundreds of Broadway productions and pre-Broadway tryouts. So he was very interested in the theater. As he became involved in General Motors, he had an apartment in New York. He and Alice had an apartment in the Carlton House on Madison Avenue. And he would be approached by various people to help underwrite events in New York. And one of those people was George Gershwin, who wanted to contribute to one of the schools in New York. And actually, Pierre declined this request because he said there's so much more need for this type of underwriting in Wilmington. So he preferred to limit his philanthropy to the Wilmington and Philadelphia area. He was a great philanthropist and a great educator. And he actually hired a musical teacher for the employees at Longwood, some of the men at Longwood. Here you have Lewis Mason on the left, Charlie Mason, his chauffeur, and William Mullis, who was the head gardener. And apparently they were given voice lessons by Fred Wyatt for at least several months. And Pierre himself took piano lessons from Fred Wyatt, although he later admitted to only taking 3 lessons, but one of the pieces he played was The Swan by Saint-Saëns. And Fred Wyatt was one of 5 students. The DuPonts underwrote the education for about 130 college-age students, and 5 of those were specifically for music. And one was Fred Wyatt, and Pierre paid for his education. He later came back to Wilmington, and he was the conductor for the Brandywiners for many years. And then on the right, you have Grisha Monoshevich, who was a Polish of Polish extraction who lived in Avondale. He became a violinist, and Pierre financed his studies in New York as well as in Europe. He eventually became a violinist with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And he named his 2 children after Pierre and Alice as a token of appreciation. Another student was Mr. Pierce, Louis Pierce, who Pierre first got into MIT. He decided he wanted to become a musician, so Pierre got him into the New England Conservatory and underwrote his studies. He became a Gilbert and Sullivan expert. So let's talk about the open-air theater at Longwood. Pierre bought Longwood in 1906 to save the trees. There was a very simple house. He started making improvements, and in 1909 he sent out his first garden party invitation. So by that time, the house had been expanded slightly, and he built an awning that came out to cover the guests in case it rained. And there would be wine and food and garden party food and entertainment, and they would always end with dancing. And in 1908, he built a big barn. As you come up to 5 Points at Longwood, where all the paths intersect, as you come up to the conservatory at the foot of the restaurant, there was this barn before there was the conservatory. So if it were to rain during a garden party, they would all retire to the barn. Well, in 1913, Pierre visited the Villa Gori. Here he is with with Alice and with his sister Margareta. And on the left there, you see a picture of the theater at the Villa Gori by Maxfield Parrish. Maxfield Parrish was a childhood friend of Pierre's, and when they were both 10, Parrish had created a small marionette theater, and he sold it to Pierre for $1, and that perhaps marked the beginning of Pierre's interest in theater. But in any event, from his garden books that he had already owned, he knew about the Villa Gori Theater, and garden theaters at this time were being built in gardens on the west coast and on the east coast of the country, usually based on Italian examples. And the one at the Villa Gori is relatively small. You see the stage to the left and the audience seating to the right. And in 2010, we actually sent a group of our members over to visit Italian gardens, and one of the stops was to see what was left of the Villa Gori. So in 1913, he had already torn down, on the left there you see the vacant site. The Pierce Barn and Barnyard had been there. He tore that down, and in 1913 they built the theater, which looked like this to begin with. And the wings are made of hemlock. Today they're arborvitae, but originally they were hemlock. And here you see a picture. That's Pierre in both pictures standing to the right, enjoying just having an outing with his family at the theater. And here are Pierre and Alice dressed up for one of the garden parties. So he would have a garden party each June, usually, sometimes in September, but usually when the garden was at its best. For the theater, he had seen this picture at the Quirinal garden in Rome, showing a secret surprise fountains. The Italian call them giochi d'acqua, water jokes. And you'd be walking by and suddenly the fountain would come on and get you wet. So he installed the same type of thing at Longwood, and there were foot pedals in front of the stage, right below the stage, and if you'd walked on them, the jets would go up and down. So the theater was first used for the 1915 garden party. You can see the stage to the left, the tables and chairs on the flat auditorium level, the buffet table, and the musicians are above one of the service buildings there on the east. There would be some type of entertainment, and in 1915 it was the Florence Noyes School of Rhythmic Expression. These were inspired by the Isadora Duncan style of dancing, and they concluded with a water ballet. And this is the afternoon rehearsal when it was photographed. Pierre was concerned that they were going to get overly wet, but apparently it worked out okay because the newspapers talked about how magical it was to see this at night with lights. The next year he built a temporary stairway to give more variety to the stage, and it was going to be, there was going to be a ballet there, but instead it rained. So he had put a tent up right in front of the Pierce house, and so everybody adjourned there, and that's where the performance was. In 1919, you can see all the tables where the audience, where today's auditorium is, and the orchestra has been now moved to a small depression in front of the stage, the orchestra pit, and you can see the dancers rehearsing. A lot of the performances were presented by John Murray Anderson, who was a New York impresario. His school he had a drama school, and people like Lucille Ball, I think, and maybe even Katharine Hepburn studied there for a while. But he obviously liked to dine with influential people here with his dog. But in his autobiography, he notes that one of the dancers was Carlos Peterson, which you see here on the left. And he was on the stage at Longwood. He was twirling around, and his boot flew off and hit a DuPont dowager in the audience. And she was pretty feisty, and so she picked up the boot, threw it back at him, and knocked him down on the stage. I mean, it sounds a little exaggerated, but. And the other performer there is Disha. She was one of the dancers in 1928. So here's the theater in 1922, and then by 1926 and 7, he decided to enlarge the theater. So he excavated under the stage, built the stairway, and put in elaborate fountains. And after the debut in September, the Marine Band was here. He took them down there to pose for a picture. And we use these fountains daily during the summer, and here you can see people enjoying them. And then by uncovering the covers on the stage, there are underground lights that, of course, allow the fountains to be illuminated after summer performances and particularly at Christmas. So the garden parties continued. This is in 1928, the Nightingale and the Rose. Here's Carnival. These were rehearsal pictures for the evening performances. And the last garden party performance was in 1940, Dances of Old Russia. But once Mrs. DuPont passed away in 1944, the garden party performances stopped, but there were a lot of other performances, always for charity. And the first being with the Savoy Company. The Savoy Company first performed here in 1916, and they came back in 1922 and have performed here every year except during the war years and during COVID until last year, and they will hopefully continue. And here you can see 1950s production. The stage at that point was tiled, and it was very slippery, and so today it's a much easier surface so that you don't slip as much. But they have come back, and they keep doing Gilbert and Sullivan year after year. In 2022, they did Ruthergore. And to mark that, they gave Pierre a sculpture, which is in the rear tower. It's 300 pounds of sculpture, stone and bronze, and it was presented to him in 1948. And in the front end papers of the book are all reproductions of all the covers to the Savoy programs. Behind the stage, or backstage, you could say, there are dressing rooms for both the men and the women, spacious hallways. When there's a production, of course, the dressing rooms are filled with colorful costumes. Under the main stage is the pump room for the fountains. And this shows some of the original equipment. The original resistance dimmers were off to one side, and then the control board for the fountains was in the rear tower. And today these have all been replaced with computerized controls. So another annual pageant that most people now have completely forgotten or never knew about were the American Legion pageants. They started in 1930 and ran to 1959. In 1933, they did The Story of Kennett, based on Bayard Taylor's book. These were local people, staged by a production company from Ohio. And here in 34, we had Arabian Nights, and in 37, Rumpelstiltskin. And these were sellout crowds of, at that point, 2,400 people in the theater, and they produced tremendous revenue for the local American Legion. In 1941, just before World War II, they did America on Parade. And then in 1976, a local group led by Neil Joines reproduced The Story of Kennett again. And the group that people most probably are familiar with are the Brandywiners. They started their first production here in 1932. It helped that one of the lead people there was Chick Laird, who was Mr. DuPont's nephew, and he convinced Pierre that would it be all right to stage these productions, and these were done for charity. Initially, there was a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan, and then they sort of branched out to other performances, other composers. Robin Hood in 1946, but then occasionally they would revert back to Gilbert and Sullivan. They would have a picnic in the theater during their first rehearsal, and here you can see the cast, everybody enjoying themselves. And then Pierre started giving them an after-performance party every year, and he requested that they all come in costume. And here you can see him enjoying one of those events. And then after Pierre's passing, they did more Broadway, have continued to do more Broadway-type productions. Kismet, Hello, Dolly, and these are usually with full orchestra, and the leads tend to be professionals, but the chorus tend to be volunteers, and it's quite an active organization, has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. My Fair Lady, in 2022, they did The Wizard of Oz, and last year they did Oliver. So it's been a long, ongoing tradition, and the back-end papers of the book list all the covers, show all the covers of the Brandywiners' performances. Now, in the 1940s and 50s, operas were also produced here. Carmen, Aida, Madame Butterfly. In 1941, the Philadelphia Orchestra played here with Eugene Ormandy, and the book reproduces the correspondence between Pierre and Eugene Ormandy, who was quite delighted to play here. The service bands have played here many years, the Marine Band and some of the sub-orchestras, the country groups and things like that. So apart from the theater, the first Longwood organ, when Pierre built the conservatory, you notice in the upper right-hand corner it says organ. And this was the first housing of the first instrument. And in fact, this was the room, and if you look over there to where the columns are, that's kind of where this building was. There was no ballroom at that point. And in the organ itself, the console, as you see in this picture, if you look at the row of columns on the left, you'll see a dark spot between the last pair, and that's where the console was. And this is Wilmer Highfield, who was a Wilmington organist, and this was probably taken in 1922. This was an Aeolian instrument. It had about 5,000 pipes, and it cost about $50,000. Now this shows the exhibition hall stage, and that room over in that corner housed, you can see the organ pipes there. Typically there would be a screen of muslin and fabric, so you wouldn't see the pipes. In 1923 and 24, Pierre built the music room next door, and he moved the console in, and you can see on the left there a close-up of the back of the console, and you can see the organ rolls in boxes in the shelves behind that. This shows the exhibition hall. If you've ever wondered, under the clock at the far end of the exhibition hall, there are two cubic pedestals, and they have pierced wrought iron grates. Initially, that was going to be an antiphonal organ that you would then play. You would hear the front organ and the rear organ, but for some reason, Pierre never chose to do that. But he was very interested in all the specifications of the organ, of the first organ, and he made detailed charts comparing this organ to other organs around the world. Eventually, when he built the second organ, he gave the first organ to the University of Delaware, and here you can see the console is there down in the orchestra pit in front of the stage. The pipes are above the proscenium. And the organ, both the first and the current organ, were originally playable by an Aeolian player, a duo art. And here you can see kind of, the book goes into detail about how it works, but you can see it's a very complicated mechanism, electro-pneumatic. And Nelson Barden in Boston devised a means of taking the original paper rolls and converting them to a computer program using this machine. So once the organ was in, once the first organ was in 1921, Pierre and Alice started hosting musicals. Every Sunday there would be a concert, and 2 Sundays a month would be reserved for the DuPonts and their friends. The other Sundays would be open to the public. And the traffic, here you can see the bottom right picture shows Polonia Drive. That was Doe Run Road. This is, as you walk up towards the conservatory, today this is part of Longwood, but back then it was a public road, so it's hard to imagine with all these cars parked there how it was possible to even pass somebody with an automobile. The console was moved into the music room. You can see the console on the right behind the sofa, and the DuPonts would sit there and watch the organist, and all the other guests would be out in the exhibition hall. And there were quite a few famous organists who played here, and the book goes into detail about who they were, but the most famous was probably Marcel Dupré, who was then substituting at Notre Dame, eventually became the organist at Saint-Sulpice in Paris, and was certainly one of the most famous organists of the 20th century. And in 1926, the National Association of Organists had their convention in Philadelphia, and they came out here. And several of the pictures in the book, there's a note that if you go to our website, under the organ part of Longwood's website, pictures like this are available in huge detail, so you can see if your great-grandparents are in the crowd. There were many other activities at Longwood: garden party meals in the exhibition hall. Sometimes they would put the overflow tables out where now the water lilies are. This was before the water lilies. And all the chauffeurs would eat in the potting shed. There would be like 200, 300 chauffeurs at some of these events. There were also many events for the employees, including the celebrated Christmas parties. And here you can see the kids enjoying a performance in the exhibition hall. The strings are connected to balloons, and typically, I was looking through the payments, typically they were always for helium, but one year, for whatever reason, perhaps with the shortage of helium, they filled them with hydrogen, and fortunately we didn't hear of any accidents. But there would be other musicians come in to help add variety, such as the Gloriette trumpeters here. The Marine Band would play. Typically, the concerts would be in the exhibition hall because Pierre was afraid of rain at the theater. But John Philip Sousa gave 14 concerts at Longwood on 7 different occasions. There would be an afternoon and an evening concert. And he became one of Mr. DuPont's friends. And here he is in the exhibition hall conducting a concert. And here you see him with Pierre. This was either taken in 1928 or 1930. It's kind of hard to figure out, but the picture on the right, he's enjoying a cigar in 1930 in the music room. Samuel Barber, who became a famous composer, was born in Westchester, and he came to Longwood a number of times as a child to listen to the concerts, and also Pierre let him play the organ, and he wrote a piece to Longwood Gardens, which we have since, it's been published and it's been recorded, it's been played here a number of times. And so the exhibition hall was the place that was used mostly for concerts, but it became a pain to have to remove all the plants, particularly in the springtime. So Pierre got the idea for another space. And initially he was going to build a big theater, which is where the East Conservatory is now. And this shows one of the early blueprints. There would have been a series of stepped terraces where the chairs would have been, and in the far distance there would have been a big stage with a curtain, proscenium, kind of like the outdoor theater. But instead he chose to build the Azalea House, which was later replaced with what we currently have. But this shows, instead, he chose to put the organ in the ballroom. And so this is a blueprint showing the elevation of the wall behind me. And here's the ballroom when it first opened. This giant table, 75 feet long, which we still have. Notice the ceiling is either fabric or paper, we're not quite sure what, but it was replaced within a year by the current pink glass ceiling. And if you've ever wondered what's above the ceiling, this is a view of how the ceiling is suspended. Again, Pierre was interested in, he was going to build a new organ. He wanted to know how Longwood's organ compared with organs around the world. So he would have these charts prepared. And the second Longwood organ, just like the first one, was built at the Aeolian plant in Garwood, New Jersey, which is outside New York. And these are pictures showing the construction of the 10,010 pipes. Pierre would go up with Furman Swinnon, the organist, and they would try everything out. This is a famous picture on the left that shows the pedal pipes, which are 32 feet long. And these are the motors for the blowers. One of the things that had just been announced was a vibroharp that Deegan came out with, which Pierre decided he would put one in. And this shows the blueprint of how the organ is arranged. And again, if you go to our website, the construction documents for how the organ is put together are available in a very large format. So if you want to build an organ like Longwood, you have the plans at home. Jonathan Ambrosino, who co-wrote this book, goes into great detail, and he analyzes what are the different varieties of tone and how the pipes are made and things like that. There's also pictures of all the various instruments, the piano, the pedal pipes, and you can actually see me standing there. You can see how big they are, which of course you can see if you go into the organ museum. And there are pictures of all the percussion instruments, all the drums, all the cymbals, the castanets, the chimes. This is a picture of the original console in 1950, and there's a double-page spread in the book that shows you how all those tablets are arranged, and it's actually in the book, it's reproduced clearly enough you can see the names of all the various stops. In 1930, the American Guild of Organists came here, and the organ really debuted at that point. And again, on our website, you can download this picture in great detail and see if any of your relatives are in there. So Mr. DuPont didn't do this all by himself. He had a talented staff. William Francis, on the left, was the initial engineer at Longwood, and he was succeeded by Roland Taylor, and both of them were helped by Phil Brewer on the right, who designed the fountains and did all the electrical work, ran the fountains, did all the production work for the theater, for the organ, things like stage lights for years and years. But the person who really helped Pierre was Titus Giese, and he was Pierre's secretary in Wilmington who did all the arrangements for all the performances. He would get the organist, he would handle all the details for the garden parties, for anything really. And perhaps his greatest contribution was he's the one who discovered Firmin Swinnen, who became the staff organist at Longwood. Firmin was born in Belgium, and at that time, his father was an organist, and Firmin often had to pump the organ for his father in an unheated church. And so that allowed him to become a member of the Guild of Former Pipe Organ Pumpers, which was kind of a humorous organization set up in this country where people who had pumped organs at some point in their life could join. And it was basically an organization to show that pipe organ pumpers amounted to something. He married Augusta in Belgium, but then World War I forced them to flee to England and eventually to New York, where he became a theater organist at the Rialto and the Rivoli theaters. And there in the bottom you can see his name in lights, Professor Swinnen Organ Overture. He became very well known for an arrangement of a piece by Widor, and he added a pedal toccata where he would play for several minutes just his feet alone, and it caused quite a sensation. Eventually, he migrated to the Aldine Theater, which was a new theater in Philadelphia, and you'll see at the bottom of this was the initial ad talking about the opening. You can see his name down there at the bottom. He's one of 3 organists. Well, eventually that kind of fell through, and Mr. DuPont, he played at Longwood, and Mr. DuPont was so impressed that eventually he became the full-time organist. And he was very successful, and Pierre rewarded him. This was his first car, apparently. He called it his boat. And if Pierre's chauffeurs were occupied, he would actually ask Firmin to take him for a ride. But Firmin was the one who designed the current organ that we have, and here you see him at the console in the factory in Garwood, New Jersey. He gave many recitals, not only at Longwood, he gave like 1,500 some recitals, but he also gave recitals throughout the eastern United States, and he advertised extensively. And I like the ad on the right where it said, "Organ recitals the public likes," because that's what he liked to play. Transcriptions, things, that's why Pierre liked him. He would play Tchaikovsky symphonies and all kinds of popular music. At one point he was asked to play for the Episcopal Church was having a national convention at Atlantic City's Convention Hall. And the story is told that when they announced him that the concert was to begin, the entire auditorium rose and started cheering. And apparently then they mentioned his name again, and the audience rose and continued cheering. And the person who made this comment said this was a group of Episcopalians who typically are rather reserved. He said, just imagine if this had been a group of Baptists. Swinnen wrote several pieces, including the Longwood Sketches, which pays tribute to 4 movements here about Longwood. He was successful enough to buy and build this house for his mother in Belgium, and he periodically would go back and visit the family. When he retired in 1956, he gave the console was kind of where it is right now. There was a dinner here, and Molly Laird, who was Mr. DuPont's niece, wrote a tribute to him, which it's set to Yankee Doodle Dandy, and I'm not going to sing it for you, but I will recite. The entire poem is reproduced in the book. I will recite a few verses here. Again, remember, this is Yankee Doodle Dandy. Old Orpheus led the music world way back in the beginning, but he was just a neophyte compared to Papa Swinnin. All the angels flap their wings and sinners give up sinnin' whene'er they hear the dulcet tones produced by Papa Swinnin. From the way he stomps the treadle board, he must have fallen arches, but no bride will ever forget his glorious wedding marches. When the church all sings out "We Three Kings," and the organ he is strummin', he rocks and bumps till you see the humps of the string of camels comin'. When concerts at the church are due, he raises quite a ruction to find the ladies of his choir involved in reproduction. Tonight we're here to testify there is no one above him. We hope he never will forget how very much we love him. So here's a picture of him in retirement. He lived on Veal Road, which is over, I guess, near Talleyville. He had a Hammond or an Allen organ. Occasionally he would come back to Longwood. He played for a couple retirement dinners and he made several recordings, and we put them all together on a CD, which is available. I don't think it's available here, but it is available off of Amazon. So once the organ was in, the second organ, Longwood kind of settled into a pleasant routine. Most of the concerts were held out in the exhibition hall and not in the ballroom. The organ was played, the windows were open, but audience was not in here during the concert. So Swinnin played very loud, and you could hear it out into the conservatory. One group that did play out in the exhibition hall was the a cappella group, and they gave a concert. This is in 1940-something. This is an interesting picture I came across. Before there was a visitor center, parking during Mr. DuPont's early years for the open-air theater would be in the cow lot, which is right, the big lot as you walk through the entrance at Longwood. But behind where you see the cars now, that was a golf course. So once the golf course was discontinued after World War II, they would park the overflow there, and you can see the view here from the conservatory. That eventually became the site for the main parking lot that we have now. So after Swinnin retired, he was succeeded by Clarence Snyder, who came down from New Jersey. He actually had been raised in Wilmington. And here you see them on Swinnin's retirement dinner. They both played the organ. He instituted a lot of new types of concerts, a new type of music. Here he is rehearsing Ravel with the harpist from the Philadelphia Orchestra. But the console was really wearing out, and so it was decided to rebuild not only the console but the entire organ by the Moeller Company of Hagerstown, Maryland. And here he is at the factory in Hagerstown discussing how the console will be laid out. So here someone is resoldering the relays in the relay boxes, and the entire percussion division was removed to Hagerstown and rebuilt there. Much of the organ, the pipes stayed here, but the wind chests were all taken there. And here you can see him at the new console. He was kind of shocked at first because it had all kinds of lights on it, indicator lights, and he said it lights up like a pinball machine, but he got used to it quickly. The organ was maintained for a number of years by Aeolian Skinner, then by Moeller, and then by Bob Goodchild on the right, who came in 1972, and he worked until 2002 here. And we started, once Clarence retired in 1978, we started hiring a performance coordinator, and that's Audrey Bauer, who was our first one. And then in the right, a picture on the right is Priscilla Johnson, and she instituted so many things like organ and piano concerts or the Philadelphia Organ Quartet. The original Longwood console was sent to Philadelphia, where it sat in a garage for a number of years. It was then rescued, and it was rebuilt, and it now is connected to the great organ at Ocean Grove in New Jersey, where it actually controls an organ that is now 12,000 pipes up there. But we use that as our inspiration and design to build a new console out in California. It arrived here in 2001. We brought it in on a specially built runway, and of course it sits over there in the corner, and it can be moved around on an air sled. The actual rebuilding of the organ started in 2004 and continued in 2014. And a lot of the pipes here, you see the pedal pipes being removed, being resoldered. Joseph Rotella did much of the restoration work. And we now have many new reservoirs. A lot of the winding, which used to be galvanized, is now stainless steel. We have a very fancy fire detection and suppression system, which you see there. Those tanks are nitrogen. And if, God forbid, a fire should erupt, the idea is the nitrogen creates a mist, which then puts out the fire without soaking the organ, because water and organs do not mix. Here you see the restoration team led by Nelson Barden. And here's a photo of our greatest supporter. This was Pierre DuPont, who's celebrating here his 90th birthday. And that's not the real organ, that is a birthday organ cake, one of the biggest cakes I've ever seen. And he sampled one of the keys and pronounced it very tasty. We took the opportunity to knock the walls out of the back there, and you know, you've probably seen our organ museum in the back behind the pipes. The organ has certainly a new life now. We have a visualizer that we can play using the computer, and we have open organ days for people who want to try the instrument. We have AGO encounters. We have instruction. I mean, it's getting a lot of use. And we appointed Peter Richard Conte, who's the organist of the Wanamaker store, as our principal organist. And we also started the Longwood Organ Competition. We've had 4 so far, and they've been very successful and brought organists from around the world. Pierre also, as I mentioned initially, loved pianos. And he, during his lifetime, had about 12 or 14 pianos. 2 that we still have. His mother's square Steinway there in the left is in the Pierce house, and the right is an Astor piano, one of the earliest pianos supposedly imported into this country, which is a beautiful piece of furniture. Unfortunately, it's beyond restoration, so we currently have it in storage. But in the music room next door was a Steinway grand piano, which we still have, and it's been restored by the Snyder family of Robson-et-Pied, Willis and his son David. And it's in top condition, and it's certainly from one of the best eras of the Steinway Company in the 1920s, and it's been played by many great pianists, including Simone Dinnerstein, who performed a flawless performance of Bach's Goldberg Variations here 2 years ago. We also have a carillon. In 1925, Pierre took this picture of a tower at the chateau on the Loing River in France, about 2 hours south of Paris. And I visited in 2018 and took the picture. And so he had a tower with an extension constructed based on that photograph, and he filled it with Deagon tower chimes. And they were operated pneumatically. Unfortunately, during the Korean War, it was decided you couldn't get parts for them, and apparently they were sold for scrap. But they were replaced with an electronic carillon by Deagon, and they were tone bars, which these little tiny strips of metal were hit by solenoids and then amplified millions of times and produced a chime-like effect. And we've also tried electronic carillons. We had some cast bell carillons, but finally, we've also had portable carillons. But finally, in 2000, we got the go-ahead to have a cast bell carillon made for us in Ijsbouts in the Netherlands. And the book goes into the whole process of how they create bells using the lost wax process. They build it up, they model the bell in wax, they put another cover on it, they take it off, they melt the wax, and you've got a hollow space where you pour the bronze. So the bells were cast in 2000 and arrived here in 2001 and put into the chimes tower. And there's 62 bells in a very small space. They can be played by hand or be played automatically by computer. So, in addition to the organ and carillon, we have continued our tradition. Here you have the second person there is Priscilla Johnson, and the center there is Ken Homer, who was our first technical director, and then Dara Gordon-Smoyer on the fourth person over. They have continued this process. This is our current staff, and Tom Warner is right there in the very center. So we have had thousands of performances. I figured that in the past 50 years, Longwood has hosted between 10,000 and 15,000 performances. So here you see the Marine Band in the 60s, the American Ballet Theater in 1962. We've had steel drum groups, lots of Asian groups to coincide with our Mum Festival. We had a Festival of the Arts in 1982. Marion McPartland there is a famous jazz pianist. Choruses, again, for the Mum Festival, a lot of Asians. We've had the acrobats from Taipei, magicians, the Tamburitsins from Duquesne University. One year we celebrated Alice's Wonderland, and there's Alice and her rabbit. We've had the Cheshire County Orchestra from England a number of times, drummers, dancers in the Italian Water Garden. We had a 3-ring circus in the exhibition hall one year for mums. We've had the Doris Humphrey dancers. We've had children's groups, Ukrainian dancers. For Oz one year we had Hot Air Balloon, as well as Dorothy. Giant puppets. The Cleveland Opera did Peter Rabbit. More puppets. The Missoula Children's Theater has come here a number of times, and local children sign up, spend a week here, and then present a production. More Asians, more Missoula Children's. We've had monks from Tibet do a mandala and then destroy it and pour the sand and the milk into our stream. The Paul Taylor II dancers, more Asians, Native Americans, Chinese opera. In 2006, for our 100th anniversary, the Kenneth Symphony of Chester County played a specially commissioned piece, and for the third movement was called Fountains, and so we could turn the fountains on. When we opened our children's garden, we had dancing flowers. We've had a lot of high school groups here. The Philadelphia Orchestra has played here several times. We've had ice skaters here, harpists, the Philadelphia Orchestra, again in the meadow down there on the bottom, the Peace Train in the ballroom, the Wine and Jazz in the main fountain garden, among other places, Jackie Evanko in the theater on the bottom there, the Australian acrobats. We've had productions in the meadow. So there's just been a lot of everything. Bollywood a couple years ago, our first concert there on the bottom after the pandemic opened. You can see how many people have been there. We've had Philadanco dancing, and we had Patti LaBelle a couple years ago to raise money for the Kennett Library. An interesting chapter is the Longwood Color Organ. Mary Hallett Greenwalt was the sister of Ethel, Mrs. William K. DuPont. Her son was Crawford Greenwalt, who became head of DuPont Company. She was quite a character. She was a pianist, but she really was interested in showing how colored light could be merged with music. So she invented her color organ. And she got Pierre convinced to put one in at Longwood. He actually built a light bridge. If you notice at the top of the exhibition hall, there's a light bridge that goes across. It's still out there. And that's where lights were hidden, as well as down below, and they put a silver drop cloth in front of the music room, and they projected colors on it. She had the instrument built out in Pittsburgh, but I go into great detail with her letters. She really wrote a lot, and she complained about all the problems that she had. She was very, very wordy, shall we say. She got several patents for her things. She was always suing people because she thought other color organs were infringing on her rights. This is the sheet music to the Moonlight Sonata, which she played, and she had Mr. DuPont's chauffeur, Charlie Mason, operate the color organ. But this was the first program, the one and only program they presented at Longwood. This is some of the devices. It looks like the color wheels that we used to put in front of our aluminum Christmas tree. But this is one of her later consoles. Eventually, the Longwood console ended up, first it went to Philadelphia, then it went to Chicago for the World's Fair. It ended up at the new chapel for Farnhurst, which was the Delaware State Mental Hospital down in Newcastle. And I'd love to know, you can see it sitting there on the right-hand side. I tried to get in there. Nobody seems to know anything about the chapel, but it would be great if it were still there. Maybe we could rescue it. But she wrote this book called Neurathar, and I quote in the book, in my book, the New York Times reviewed it, and they just didn't know what to make of some of her sentence structure. Is crazy. It's like she was on drugs. But the funniest thing is that I conclude the chapter by reciting a story that Chick Laird told me, that the Brandywiners were thinking of giving some money to the Chester County Hospital. They needed a new anesthesia machine. And Pierre said, well, if all they need is a new type of gas machine, why don't you send, it would be cheaper and easier to send Mrs. Greenwald over to the hospital. So then we talk a little bit in the book about musical fountains. Pierre never really put music with fountains. That started in 1980, as well as our fireworks. And we've had over 175 fireworks shows since. And we will be bringing fireworks back again this summer. And so at the very end of the book, there's a very brief primer to give you a few indications of the history of organs, from the development of the types of organ pipes on Greek vases to a hydraulis, which was invented in Alexandria, Egypt. And then during the pre-electricity era, how did a pipe organ work then? As well as we tell you how the two types of pipes, the flue pipes and the reed pipes, work. And then there's an interesting drawing in the back showing, you would think, I've always said, when you press a key, it's like pressing a doorbell button. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. When under each pipe at point A there is an electromagnet. And when you press a key, that energizes, it pulls a little valve up at B, and that instantly sets into action C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and J is where the organ pipe sits. So inside this box, there's pressurized air. And it's just kind of amazing that it has to be so complicated. But there are 21 chests like the one on the left in our Longwood organ, and there are 80 chests like the one on the right. So finally, there's a list in the book of all the recordings, LPs, tapes, CDs, and DVDs that we've produced at Longwood over the years. So that's kind of in a nutshell the history of Longwood's performing arts. Are there any questions? If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you so everybody can hear what you would like to know.
Where was the house in Philadelphia where Pierre lived?
It was 3500 Powelton Avenue.
Over in West Philly.
It is no longer standing. It's been replaced. Anybody else?
Are there any DuPonts still involved at the head of Longwood and the music programs?
Well, yes, the family has a number of our trustees here. They're not really involved in the daily operations of, we have staff members. We have a large performing arts staff that does all the scheduling, and then we have the maintenance of the instruments. The organ tuner is based in Boston, comes down, will be down next week before the concert. We have an organ recital next Friday. So yes, they are involved, but very peripherally. Well, thank you very much. If you read the book, there's 100 times more detail there. I mean, I've touched on some of the important points, but hopefully it'll answer every question you would ever have about performing arts at Longwood. Thank you.